Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am here with Joe Folley, who's joined us on the Nietzsche podcast to give us some, in this case, solicited advice. I've brought him on to discuss, well, I guess broadly, the question of meaning, meaninglessness, values, valuelessness, and different philosophical perspectives on all of that. But before we get into that, Joe, could you just briefly introduce yourself to the audience? They should definitely go check out your 4 hour long tier list video with Jared Henderson. I just watched it. I very much enjoyed it, and it's worth watching in a couple sittings.
Thank you very much. And thank you for having me. My name's Joe. I run like a kind of philosophy channel called Unsolicited Advice, where I just sort of largely do kind of introductions to different thinkers with a kind of aim to put people in a position where they can kind of then go and explore for themselves. Yeah, no, it just kind of fell into it, really. It was good fun.
I like that ethos. That's kind of the way I think about what I'm doing as well. I would like people to go and read the books that I talk about, more so than just take my opinions on things. Maybe it might be appropriate to begin by talking about one of Nietzsche's more famous aphorisms, just to sort of introduce the topic. And that would be the madman passage from The Gay Science. God is dead. God remains dead. As Nietzsche elaborates elsewhere in the book, the Christian belief has become unworthy of belief. And he says in the genealogy and in his notes in Will to Power, the highest values have devalued themselves. And so there's many ways of talking about the secular malaise, the modern malaise that many people feel. Perhaps one of the ways of approaching this is the question of values, which is deeply connected to the question of meaning. Nietzsche writes in Twilight of Idols, a formula for our happiness is a yes, a no, a straight line, a goal. And so Christianity had that to some extent. It explained the meaning of life. It gave life a telos. It gave us an explanation for our suffering, even for evil. That's all part of the story of redemption, right? With the declining belief in Christianity, and as Nietzsche sees it, sort of the inevitability of those values devaluing themselves, there's many possible responses to this situation. There's, of course, Nietzsche's own solution, the revaluation of values, creation of new tablets of values, seizing the right for ourselves to determine what the meaning of life is. Nietzsche, I think, would hope we create a new Dionysian morality, but he has this experimental quality to his philosophy where he thinks that, he just hopes we'll try new things because he sort of has this fundamental belief that life without valuations is not possible, that the will would rather will nothingness than not will at all. But then on the other hand, we have a figure like Camus, who has this approach of absurdism, in which the question is not so much, in the wake of this, or in perhaps the dawning perception of the devaluation of the highest values. The question is not how do we find new ones, but how do we confront that situation and live without meaning, without values? I guess the first thing I wanted to ask you, maybe I have two questions in a sense. First, do you think Nietzsche really got the situation right? I know it's kind of a tall order to ask you to come out of the gate criticizing Nietzsche, but what do you see sort of the state of like Christianity and philosophy in our society? And is that an accurate assessment of the situation? And then secondly, who do you find yourself aligning with in terms of if we were presenting, I know again, there's many possible responses to the situation, but between sort of the Nietzschean or the Camus absurdist?
I mean, first of all, I think that, statistically, Nietzsche is like undeniably right about the decline of belief in Europe and America, right? As in, obviously him focusing on Europe. There just is less religious belief than there has been in the past, and it at the very least seems like, from what I've read and from someone I talked to on my own channel recently, he runs a channel called Religion for Breakfast, so everyone just go check out. It's a very good channel. It doesn't seem like religious belief is returning. The idea that there's a kind of Christian revivalist backlash is sort of an online phenomenon. It's in anecdotes. It's in like really kind of sexy stories like Ayaan Hirsi Ali converting to Christianity after having been an atheist and a borderline anti-theist for a very long time. But it's just not, at least at present, reflected in the data. It could be at some point. Like I'm not kind of ruling it out. But I already think Nietzsche was definitely correct in that prediction. I think that there are loads of things that I think that, like, I think one of the interesting things about Nietzsche, I think Kaufman talks about this at the beginning of his book on Nietzsche, which is that he says that it's lovely reading Nietzsche and kind of engaging with him because even when you disagree, he always has something incredibly fascinating to say. I think I can't remember the exact phrasing. It's something like, he very rarely comes across a philosopher that he disagrees with more, but enjoys reading more. It's something like that. I can't remember the exact phraseology. First of all, I think that Camus actually takes quite a lot from Nietzsche. We have a fair amount of evidence that as like a very kind of young person, like a teenager, like late teens, Camus encountered some of Nietzsche's writings on art, for example, and that's thought to have had a very profound impact on Camus. The other thing that's interesting about the way that Camus engages with Nietzsche is that he almost exclusively talks about the affirmatory part of Nietzsche, which is kind of odd, right? Like, as in, I know that talking about the affirmatory part of Nietzsche is all the rage now, but there was for a long time the kind of no-saying aspect of Nietzsche's philosophy was much more prominent, and Camus almost exclusively talks about the affirmatory side when he talks about Nietzsche. In for example, The Rebel, he has a brief discussion of Nietzsche. He was also found with a copy of The Gay Science in his pocket when he died in a car crash. So there's we certainly know that Nietzsche had a profound influence on Camus, though it's difficult to pin down like exactly where it crops up because like a lot of literary philosophers, Camus is not always explicit with what other thinkers have inspired his thoughts, right? He's not, I don't think he's being dishonest or anything, but like he's writing in that style where, he's not necessarily interested in charting the exact genealogy of his own thoughts. There are a couple of interesting point of comparisons I think we can make between some of the stuff that Camus says in The Myth of Sisyphus and that I think, at the very least, seems like it could have originated in Camus' study of Nietzsche. One of them is just the idea that he occasionally discusses the lack of transcendent value in ways that seem just like quite Nietzschean in flavor. There's a point where he talks about, only liking truths that you can get your hands on and stuff like that. And that's pretty Nietzschean. And his kind of disdain for religious values and kind of transcendence in general, I think is obviously very Nietzschean, though of course not necessarily like unique to Nietzsche. The thing that I think makes Camus' philosophy very, very interesting, partly because I think that one of the interesting places that Camus inhabits in our kind of cultural dialogue is that he's either seen as a kind of guru almost, or like a guy that talked nonsense. He's often quite dismissed academically, but kind of worshipped in a lot of kind of online spheres. And I just like to bring a kind of middle ground between these two camps. There is good academic work that goes on in Camus scholarship, and I just kind of want to bring it to the forward a bit more. A book that I read that had a really big impact on the way that I view Camus was by a guy called John Folley, funnily enough, no relation, I wish it was, called Albert Camus, From the Absurd to Revolt. And he kind of basically makes the point there that he's trying to kind of create a sort of coherent through line in Camus' philosophy. And I suppose I'd like to see a little bit more of that kind of middle way where we can kind of appreciate Camus' work and also critique it without kind of falling into either the camp of discarding it or just kind of absorbing it uncritically. I also think that Camus generally is sort of flattened a fair amount in public discourse in a way that, I suppose all complex philosophers inevitably are. But for example, an idea that you'll commonly hear when people are discussing Camus online is something like, Camus thinks that we need to learn to accept that there is no meaning, or something like that, which is one of the things that is kind of true at one level, but not quite true at another. Because, of course, there's a sense in which by saying that there is no transcendent meaning and that we're going to have to live regardless, that is a form of acceptance, right? But it kind of paints absurdism as this kind of quite calm, chill, placated sort of philosophy. And that's not how Camus describes it at all. He describes it as in terms of rebellion and revolt and things like that. And, this is a theme that emerges in his later works much more prominently, but it's something that's there right from the start, And interesting, while we're kind of talking about points of comparison between Camus and Nietzsche, the idea of the kind of scornful laugh appears a lot in The Myth of Sisyphus. First of all, Don Juan, and then the scornful laugh of Sisyphus himself. And again, I kind of find that hard to... It's such a specific image, I find that hard to believe that that's not a point of inspiration at the very least. But again, I think it illustrates something important about Camus' philosophy, which is that far from being a kind of passive acceptance of meaninglessness, it is a kind of rebellion against the idea that life is meaningless, while at the same time seemingly taking on board that it must be. It's a sort of, it's yeah, it's very difficult to put into words because it's almost paradoxical.
It's as if you have to sort of constantly, the absurdist middle way, to put it in Buddhist terms, you're sort of constantly having to challenge the absolutists and the nihilists, not really as an external thing. I think I get the sense with Camus, this is something within yourself, an attraction to, what does he say, commit philosophical unaliving of yourself, to sort of, cede the battleground, and just sort of throw yourself into an irrational meaning, or to just throw yourself into a sort of hedonism, or like in the Marquis de Sade, sort of justifying whatever power relations currently exist. Absurdism seems to provide you with, I guess, really infinite potential in a way, but it is much more of a active, struggling. That's the vibe that I get from reading Camus.
Yes, a phrase or a kind of epithet, I suppose, he repeatedly kind of comes back to is the idea that absurdism, both in some senses living without hope and yet also not despairing. And he also has a really interesting definition of nihilism, which is in The Rebel, he talks about nihilism as not just despairing and negating, but kind of desiring to despair and desiring to negate. So there's a kind of, I think that when Camus talks about nihilism, he's talking about something significantly more destructive than simply like meaninglessness. I think that might give us a hint as to how to kind of understand what Camus might be getting at. Because obviously when people hear about absurdism affirming the proposition that life has no meaning, I think a lot of people understandably think, well, like that is just nihilism, right? Like in what way does this differ? And I think that this destructive idea of nihilism, I think helps us to clarify what exactly Camus is trying to separate his absurdism from. There are loads of interesting things you kind of put Camus in dialogue with. One of the most interesting, and I think one that he compares himself to a fair amount. I don't know if this is the philosophy he compares himself to the most, but he certainly revisits this comparison on many, many times. Is actually Descartes. Like Camus compares himself to Descartes. That I think is really interesting, right? Because that's not a philosophy we tend to associate with Camus. Descartes' methodological doubts. What does that have to do with Camus? We tend to think about the philosophers that come to mind when you picture Camus. It's like Sartre, de Beauvoir, Nietzsche. All of these kinds of vibes. Whereas the person who Camus compares himself to a fair amount is Descartes, and I think that this is an important thing to bear in mind when we talk about something like the myth of Sisyphus, is that he describes it in his later writings as a work of methodological doubt. So a kind of breaking down of the kind of very idea of transcendent values, and also the idea of the necessity of transcendent values. And this is, again, I think this is something that's quite difficult to bring out in the text, because if a close reading of the myth of Sisyphus reveals a lot of internal tensions. A really good example of this is he, almost within a few pages of one another, says both that we inevitably yearn for some kind of transcendent meaning, and also that transcendent meaning is no good. That, like, what would transcendent meaning have to do with a human life? I think that it's very easy to kind of ignore these inner tensions in Camus' philosophy, but they're just kind of there. And I think that one way of attempting to resolve them, which may or may not have been the way that Camus would have wanted them resolved, would be to treat a lot of his earlier work, things like The Myth of Sisyphus and The Stranger and Caligula, which is a great play that is often not discussed, but I think is really important for Camus' like general oeuvre, as a sort of no-saying part of Camus, and things like The Plague and The Rebel as like much more a kind of yes-saying part of Camus. We have this, the contrast between the image of Sisyphus, this kind of lone rebel or revolter against the gods, who's laughing scornfully and finding his own happiness in his torment. It shares a lot in common with the people at the end of the plague, who are kind of the survivors who have fought seemingly like without much purchase against the plague in Iran, and are now, and sort of saying, Dr. Ryu says at the end that he's now going to serve the memory of the people that have passed away, which is, again, that's another kind of hopeless thing to do, right? Serving someone's memory is all well and good, but like it literally is, it's living in service to something that is gone and will never come back. And I think so, but the difference is that Dr. Ryu at the end of the plague has a very kind of like group-based rebelling against the absurd, in contrast to the kind of solitariness of Sisyphus. I think that's very important. I think that in a lot of ways, the contrast between early Camus and late Camus seems to be in how communal this revolt gets. Part of this is, of course, that he finds, I'll talk about Caligula for a little bit, because I think it's just, again, it's fantastic play, and it's not talked about nearly enough. In this kind of fictionalized version of the rule of the Emperor Caligula, Caligula's kind of conceived of as a good emperor who then plunges himself into grief and meaninglessness when his lover dies. And, he basically says, I'm paraphrasing Camus here, he basically says, everyone's mortal, we're all going to die, what's the point? I guess I'm just going to be tyrannical. And the main conspirator, Chariot, who ends up kind of murdering Caligula with a bunch of co-conspirators, shares many of the same foundations that Caligula's making his claim with. He also thinks that life is meaningless. But he nonetheless finds a way, a kind of a seemingly irrational way, to say, no, I'm not going to put up with the fact that you're being tyrannical. And I think in a lot of ways that tension really exemplifies early Camus, where he's kind of deeply ambivalent about the conclusions that he's coming to, right? Another good example of an internal tension in the myth of Sisyphus is that he repeatedly says people like Don Juan, the actor and the conqueror, who are painted as reasonably amoral characters, he repeatedly says, these are not ideals. And he says, the absurd is not a kind of license to do anything. It's not at all clear to me that he actually demonstrates that the absurd dictates limits. And I think in many ways, this is part of Camus' big seeming, at the very least, dissatisfaction with his early work, and something that he seems to want to try and rectify in his later work, is that he wants to try and define limits for the absurd. He tries to do this by transferring this kind of solitary absurdist into a kind of group absurdism that eventually ends up culminating in this kind of almost, I don't want to use the word ideal, but I think it probably is an ideal, of universal solidarity, which, is a far cry from his starting point of the myth of Sisyphus, right? This is why I think that the Descartes comparison is relatively apt, because he kind of has all of this breaking down in his early work, and then he's attempting to start from a position of revolting against the absurd and seeing what he can build up from there in his later works. He thinks he can build quite a lot. I'm not really convinced that he does, but I do think that's very interesting to kind of get inside the head of Camus' trajectory.
In Camus' early work, there's this question of, as you put it, transcendent meaning or perhaps absolute meaning, something to that effect. And it seems that in his later work, you mentioned The Rebel, he's working from this premise of this sort of irrationally determined value of life, that regardless of what sort of philosophical or theological or transcendent absolute justifications we might try to come up with, and I might even appeal to Sartre and in bad faith try to use that as a way of justifying ourselves in our actions in some way, or telling ourselves, circumscribing our actions even, and telling ourselves what is forbidden to us or what we're not allowed to do. He finds another kind of meaning, it seems, in how we act and what we actually act as though we actually believe. And so there is also this element where we could look back to other figures such as Spinoza with the conatus, or Schopenhauer with will to live, or Nietzsche with will to power, where it is as if what we're zeroing in on is just this irrational impulse to continue to live, to continue to seek one's desires, as Schopenhauer would have it, whereas Nietzsche would have it to overcome resistances, feel one's power, something like this. And that is what is driving somebody like, say, Caligula, even as he has no absolute meaning. And it seems to me that Camus comes to the conclusion early on, do we really need this absolute meaning? But then what he seems to find is he's zeroing in on the same thing that many past philosophers had found. Nietzsche would have sort of countered that we're always making valuations and judgments, even down to the physiological level, even down to the level of our perceptions. On that way of looking at things, on that level of perspective, it's not possible to live without valuations. Where they would both agree is construing these moral valuations into transcendent facts. It seems like Camus almost, the way you're laying it out, would seem to come to a position that's more similar to Nietzsche, perhaps, in his later work, although he finds this communal feeling instead of an individual ethos. Would you agree with that?
I think so. I think that there's a phrase from The Rebel that he uses, which he places an awful lot of emphasis on, which says, I rebel, therefore we exist, which of course is a play on the cogito. I think that, again, I can't really, this is just how I've come to interpret Camus, I wouldn't make any claim that this is necessarily what he intended, is that similar to the way that Descartes appeals to, like, specifically indubitability, when he talks about "I think, therefore I am," he actually appeals to something that's not quite truth, a thing that can't be doubted, which, in my kind of dirty pragmatist meta-philosophy, I've always thought as a kind of lovely bit of early pragmatism, even though it's probably not. He talks about in The Rebel, the thing that he appeals to is something slightly beyond a demand for the continuation of life, or the quantity of life, as he puts it there. He talks about like a demand for respect. It's a kind of dignity claim. I think in many ways, the way that I charitably interpret this in a way that doesn't make Camus immediately construct a kind of ideal out of thin air is to attribute him the argument of something like, this is the unavoidable result of feeling yourself kind of be imposed upon, feeling injustice, like a felt sense of injustice upon yourself, like an indignation, to use a term that's slightly kind of less loaded than injustice, and then kind of building up from there, that being the kind of involuntary response, almost, the kind of indubitable reaction, or its equivalent. I don't necessarily know if that's how Camus would interpret it. That's how I can try and extract him, because otherwise it just seems like he's conjuring up an ideal out of thin air, right? When he's just saying like, oh yeah, we actually want dignity. It's like, well, where does that come from? How is that not, as philosophical unaliving? That seems to be appealing to something, relatively transcendent and ex nihilo. I think that this kind of unavoidable response is the most charitable way that I can try and construct something that's not that out of this maneuver.
Sure. I mean, I guess because you could argue that Hegel had in many ways made very many similar points to Camus, but he's seeing this search for dignity, for mutual recognition of our common humanity as a revelation of the absolute mind. And that it carries us up into the clouds of idealism, whereas, as you say, the comparison to Descartes is that for Camus, we're just looking at what can't be doubted. We can raise all sorts of intellectual doubts, but in actual fact, we don't actually doubt it. We don't doubt that we would wish to rebel if our dignity was impinged upon. Sitting around waiting for some sort of absolute stamp of justification for your rebellion would seem, that's never going to come. When you brought up something earlier, a point I wanted to branch off from, you were talking about this idea of no hope and no despair. It strikes me that this is one of the most common philosophical themes, for all the differences between, say, the Stoics and the Skeptics, or a very radical figure like Spinoza. This goal of being free, Spinoza calls hope and despair the sad passions. Ataraxia, as the Skeptics define it, and the Stoics define it, represents this state, this tranquility in which you are no longer sort of pulled away from all the potential pleasures of life, the calmness you could have in life by imaginings of the past and the future. It's interesting to me that philosophy always seems to gravitate towards this idea of, fulfilling a similar function to religion and granting us that sort of reprieve or peace of mind through the way that we think about the world. It's like, rather than arriving there through faith or traditional beliefs, you can logic your way into a kind of tranquility. I was wondering what you think about that impulse in philosophy and the extent that it comes out in absurdism.
The Stoic connection to absurdism, I think, is underexplored, partly because we know that Epictetus was quite a big influence on Camus quite young. So when Camus was diagnosed with tuberculosis, it was his first encounter with his own mortality. One of his, I can't remember if it's the right or the left, but one of his lungs had tuberculosis. It later spread to the other. And while he was recovering from his first kind of tubercular attack, which I don't know if is the correct medical term, but he was very, very ill for quite a long time.
And probably smoking cigarettes the whole time.
Of course, it's 20th century, 20th century philosophy. You've got to be smoking near constantly. But anyway, he read Epictetus there, and that seemed to bring him some consolation. So I think that the Stoic connection to absurdism, as I say, I think it's actually relatively underexplored, partly because the idea of accepting your fate and loving your fate obviously crops up in both Stoicism and Nietzsche. It's there in Camus too, often in a slightly disguised form. When Sisyphus is rebelling against his torment, he is at the same time sort of loving it, right? When he's learning to love rolling the boulder up the hill, like sure, he's throwing a middle finger up at the gods. His kind of rebellion is his happiness. At the same time, that is not the idea of loving your eternal torment is kind of an almost exaggerated form of amor fati. And it also crops up in the passages when Camus is talking about Don Juan, because one of the things that he says about Don Juan is that when other people come and try and take him to task for his licentiousness, Don Juan isn't bothered. He basically sees it as part of the game. This idea of life or existence as a kind of game, I think is kind of an undercurrent in the myth of Sisyphus. Not that Camus says this explicitly, but I think it's one of the closest comparisons we have from everyday life to this kind of double vision that Camus' absurd heroes in the myth of Sisyphus seem to have, where at a kind of first order level, they're participating in life. They're taking it like seriously, almost. Don Juan genuinely does want to seduce all of those women. And at a second order level, they're distancing themselves from those actions. They're saying, oh, well, it doesn't really matter, what the hell. And the closest thing I can think of to a everyday comparison here is playing a game, like a board game. If you're playing a board game, you're earnestly trying to achieve the first order goals of the game, at the same time disowning their importance from a kind of second order level. I find that to be quite a helpful everyday example to bring out what I think Camus might be getting at here. An interesting point of comparison you can make here is specifically with Bernard Regenster's way of interpreting Nietzsche's will to power, where he talks about it being a way of you are willing your first order desires, but you're also at a second order level willing resistance to your first order desires and willing to overcome them, but not being able to do that second order process without a first order process underneath, because you're quantifying over the facts of the first order process, which is like a painfully analytic philosophy way of talking about that. But I think you see a kind of similar pattern in Camus. His absurd heroes are, at least in the myth of Sisyphus, less so in The Stranger, interestingly enough, participating in the game of life and enjoying the game of life, while at the same time, at a second order level, saying that it doesn't matter. And this attitude, Camus is like really clear on, is incredibly difficult to maintain, which kind of makes sense, right? If you're immersed in the first order desires of life, it's very difficult to, at the same time, affirm that they don't really matter. Camus talks about this with regards to creation. So he says that the absurd activity par excellence is creation in full lucidity of the absurd, which, yeah, it's an incredibly difficult thing to do. When you're making a video or something, and I find this when I'm writing my scripts or writing my Substack posts, it's very difficult not to, in the moment, completely forget that it doesn't really matter. You know what I mean? Like because as you're doing something, right, you are almost implicitly in your actions lending credence to it. I've been trying to, just as a kind of experiment, trying to inhabit this attitude. And you know what? Camus is really right. It's really bloody hard, because as soon as you're immersed in a first order activity, it is very difficult to remain aware at a second order level that it doesn't really matter. It's almost impossible. If somebody in the comments has got that, then please let me know and take me under your wing, because I find it very, very difficult. But yeah, I think that this kind of two-order way of approaching life is at least central to how I interpret Camus.
So there's a story from Cicero sources it to Heraclides Ponticus about the philosopher Pythagoras, who went to speak to Leon, the king of the Phliaci. When Leon asked him, because they didn't have this is supposed to be how the word philosopher was coined, because he says, what kind of special art do you practice? And Pythagoras says, I practice no art, but I'm a philosopher. And Leon says, what's that? And he says that the life of man to him resembled those great games that the Greeks busy themselves with, some of whom come to compete for glory or for a crown, some of whom come to bet and wager in order to make themselves rich. But the third type, who are by far the best, come simply to spectate and to watch and observe and inquire into the nature of things. And that's what the philosopher is like. And he sees life as sort of, you're entering the marketplace like a sailor who just made port and you're going to be setting sail the next day. It's really interesting because Pythagoras' religious beliefs of metempsychosis, of the migration of the soul, would have it that quite literally life is a temporary thing that does not matter. This particular incarnation is just something that you can let it pass. In that sense, you can just be a spectator, an observer. And that's the best way to live, is the claim of Pythagoras. The funny thing is that Cicero cites this and this sort of gets back to the earlier point that we were talking about, the consolatory aspect of philosophy versus what we might, think of as maybe the more rebellious or revolting or active, philosophy. I think often of the passage of Nietzsche where he says that passion is better than stoicism and hypocrisy is, I believe, from Wagner at Bayreuth. And so in any case, when Cicero cites this story of Pythagoras, it's in a work that he's writing. He's trying to console himself after the death of his daughter. And much of the work is about the sort of the Stoic conviction that virtue alone is sufficient for happiness, and that all you can't sort of count on any of the travails of life, because fate could be rather fickle. So, you could end up in prison, you could end up tortured, you could end up executed. So the only thing that you have to rely on is virtue. And in a way, it's I hate to say this, but it's like Cicero is coping in a very real sense, though. I hate to say that because that word is so like dismissive now. But there are times in life where you need to cope, and there are so many people, as you say. Epictetus is an example. Boethius is a very famous example. But then there's that other side, right, of philosophy is spurring you on to action. That quote of, passion being better than stoicism, or Goethe saying he hates everything that doesn't quicken his activity. And another thing that came to mind when you were talking about this two levels, the first and second order considerations, and how you actually want the tension of the game. It made me think of Nietzsche's theory, or his hypothesis, that the practice of ostracism in ancient Greece, originally the purpose was to banish the person who was best, who was outshining everyone else at certain endeavors. So like all the poets are competing and one poet is winning the competitions every year. And so you have ostracism so they can vote to banish him from the city. But Nietzsche says that the point is that the Greeks loved agonistic competition, that it was sort of definitive of their entire approach to life, and that the game has to continue. And what you want is like a critical mass of geniuses who are all in tension with one another. It's like this desire to have enemies and a desire to have rivalry. And therefore, that means a desire to have someone that opposes you and that you can be in tension with, out of the view that is productive. And so there's like that hard edge to a lot of the ancient philosophy Nietzsche likes, like Heraclitus, that war is the father of all, the king of all, which is a very different message from sort of the consolatory version of philosophy or something like this. And it seems to me as though you're saying that, like, in a way, Camus is like absurdly balancing both of these. And because you can't really appeal to either one as like a sort of a universal principle or meaning of philosophy or something like that.
Yeah, I think that you're right, and that Camus definitely has a foot in each of those camps. For me, I think absurdism has got to be at the second order level, because he explicitly denies that you need to imitate any of these first order examples. And he says, an absurdist could be the president of the country, it could be an office worker, it could be anyone. And then, right at the end, he likens Sisyphus to just like a common laborer or an office worker, just kind of somebody going about the kind of general trials and tribulations of their life. However, it seems to me that he is also taking a leaf from the kind of willing your own struggle camp, because otherwise the image of Sisyphus loving the process of rolling the boulder up the hill is kind of idle. So I think that, I think he attempts at the very least to balance these two things or partake in both of them at the same time. Of course, this is also a reason why quite a lot of people come away from the myth of Sisyphus or come away from Camus thinking, I'm not sure whether this is coherent. And to be totally honest, I'm not sure whether it's totally coherent either. I think that I think that's part of what makes it such an interesting text to grapple with.
Well, I want to bring up something though, because the image, if you just take it as a psychological image, the myth of Sisyphus, that in fact you can't ever rest your hopes for happiness on the completion of a goal in real life, not even for somebody who's condemned to eternal torment. Happiness comes out when we're pursuing goals and when we feel as if our lives are meaningful and fulfilling when we are in the pursuit. The idea of like having to affirm just the act of pushing, not affirming the boulder finally reaching its place. It seems to me that that's actually the position that we're in, because, as we all know, that when people retire, their life expectancy goes, it's one of the worst things, it's like, if as long as you have a purpose, as long as you have, struggle, which is a very strange thing to think, right? Because you're effectively saying you're wishing for the boulder to push against. In absolute terms, you would say that that's awful, that Sisyphus, who could possibly wish for that? But if you're aware of the fact that there's none of this really matters, you can hold that thought to mind where you're trying to go about your sort of daily tasks or something like that, or writing a Substack article, or even something really meaningful. Oh, I just had my first child. What does it really matter? The universe is going to experience heat death in, 14 billion years or something like this.
Yeah.
So to me, it seems as if the joy that you could take in simply pushing is almost a way of not thinking about that meaninglessness in a sense. In a strange way, it could be a way of consoling yourself. The active philosophy could be a way of consoling yourself by almost like dissolving the need to even have the thought of what the transcendent meaning is.
Yes, I think that the point about ends, I think, is really important because, a lot of the image of Sisyphus is in the endlessness of it. The idea that, okay, Sisyphus gets his boulder to the top of the hill, it rolls back down again and he has to do it again. There's like lots of mini ends in service of no one great end, which to me, again, indicates this kind of second order attitude towards a series of first order desires, which are in and of themselves not desires. Which again, it's just it's a strange thing to get your head round. And again, I think this is where it comes back to the fact that Camus describes this as such a difficult mental state to inhabit. He talks about the kind of almost the habitual valuing that we do, where we take one of our first order desires and turn it into a kind of transcendent value, or we fall into the mental habit of thinking, yes, this thing really matters, even if you're otherwise a relatively well-behaved absurdist, and if you were to really focus hard on it, you would think, oh yeah, no, it doesn't really matter. But actually maintaining that tension in your head at all times, which is the thing that Camus keeps coming back to, is maintaining it in your awareness, is incredibly difficult. And I think, I think that this wish to go on willing, almost, is part of what I think Camus is getting at. And you can really see the kind of inspiration from Nietzsche here. I think also, on the subject of the unsatisfying nature of just ends, we also know that Camus read quite a lot of Schopenhauer in his youth too. So, give you an idea of potentially the intellectual heritage of this kind of skepticism of ends. But again, he doesn't embrace the ascetic reaction of Schopenhauer. He goes in a quite different direction.
Right. How would you sort of frame Camus versus Schopenhauer? I mean, could we frame him as saying we must imagine the blind, ceaseless, striving will to be happy?
Potentially. I think that, funnily enough, a few of his critics accused Camus of being a pessimist or a kind of closet pessimist. So it is something that was brought up during his lifetime. I think that the primary difference between Camus and Schopenhauer here is first of all, Schopenhauer does dictate a kind of first order set of reactions to realizing the pessimistic truth, right? The idea of consciously reining in your will that's a prescription, like not like a heavyweight capital P prescription, but it is, a purely, what's the term? It's a purely kind of everyday prescription, a kind of a pragmatic prescription, I suppose, or prudential prescription. That's the word I was looking for, as opposed to a moral one. We don't see the same kind of recommendation of a particular set of first order actions in early Camus. However, this does seem to be something that he himself decides to disagree with. For example, if we compare the myth of Sisyphus, where he says that any set of first order desires is compatible with absurdism, because absurdism is this second order attitude that you have towards your own desires, a kind of a hopelessness without despair. Then, coming towards the plague and the rebel, absurdism does entail a set of first order actions, or at the very least it forbids some first order actions. It forbids things like killing without necessity and things like that, which, that's a first order prescription. It's not like, oh, you can kill, but you have to have a particular attitude towards it. It's like, no, like there are also definite circumstances under which Camus does not want you to kill and thinks that is not part of absurdism, which again is a real significant, for me at least, development in his thought. It's interesting. I just want to bring us back to the kind of the comparison with Descartes and the epistemology of Camus, because although the parts of the myth of Sisyphus that get the most attention are the kind of existential parts, he begins it with an epistemological idea of the absurd, which is that you could never understand the universe. You could never understand it on its own terms, and it's not human enough for you to understand in your terms, which is like a very kind of straightforwardly epistemic claim to make. Which he then kind of doesn't touch upon too much. But I think that a lot of the behavior of Camus' characters in his novels, and then a lot of his later writings is framed, if there was like a theme that I was going to frame it around, it would be a real distaste for certainty. It's almost, that this kind of idea of a distaste for transcendent meaning kind of goes hand in hand with this distaste for certainty. In The Stranger, Meursault, the reason why Meursault is like so disgusted by the priest that comes to him is because he's like, how are you so certain about this? He finds the certainty itself distasteful. And then later on in The Plague, Dr. Ryu kind of admonishes Father Panlu, who is the priestly figure who helps them fight the plague, but at the same time has this general sense that, of course, everything that's going on is in line with God's will and therefore in some cosmic sense must be justified. And at one point in the plague, a child dies from the plague. And Dr. Ryu kind of just freaks out at Father Panlu. It's like, how could you possibly affirm this? And the thing that Dr. Ryu is taking issue with there is the certainty of Father Panlu. It's the, it really kind of this whole event really shakes Father Panlu. But at the time, the thing that Dr. Ryu is taking issue with is the idea that Father Panlu is claiming to have an easy, transcendent explanation for everything that's going on. That certainty seems to be what really gripes Dr. Ryu. And then in The Rebel, the thing that Camus takes issue with his kind of contemporary intellectuals in France is what he sees as their messianic faith in a kind of end of history to come. It's interesting. I mean, Camus on Marx is his own topic. If anyone goes out and reads The Rebel, an important bit of context is that when Camus is critiquing people like Hegel or Marx, he's not really critiquing Hegel or Marx. He's critiquing them at like 2 or 3 points removed. Because when it comes to Hegel, he's critiquing not Koshev's interpretation of Hegel, but people around him's interpretation of Koshev's interpretation of Hegel. Which is why if you read it and you come across a bunch of really weird ideas about Hegel, or very, very, very confidently asserted claims about Hegel that would strike you as understandably fishy, that's why. And likewise for Marx. He calls Marxism a kind of messianic doctrine. And I'm sure that many I don't know Marx that well. I'm sure that many Marxist scholars would take issue with that. He is criticizing Marx at kind of 2 steps removed, the kind of the French intellectuals he sees around him and how they use Marxist doctrine. But in that case too, he is critiquing a kind of certainty in an end to come. And this is like a really interesting epistemic theme throughout Camus' works that kind of runs alongside the existential theme. Whenever he's critiquing transcendence, he is almost always also critiquing certainty, which I think is incredibly interesting because, again, we associate Camus with the existential questions. And Camus himself seems to think that existential questions are very, very closely tied to epistemic questions. And that the kind of practical manifestation of transcendent values is overly certain values.
Yeah, there's a historical context as well, right? Insofar as the religious certainty that had taken on a political form that many of the people around Camus probably had sympathies with at the time as the Soviet Union. And that's what he's grappling with a lot of the time, is that it's not just in an abstract sense. Like, these aren't just sort of ivory tower questions of how certain we are about our moral convictions. When they attain a level of certainty that we might call like a religious certainty or a religious level of zealotry, there are real consequences, and that it could be almost seen as like a revolutionary or a rebellious act against this to resolve to be uncertain.
And suddenly this translates into in The Rebel to Camus' philosophy of limits, which is essentially a sort of a style of doing politics and doing political rebellion, which is also run through with doubt. He's very, very hesitant to impose things on other people, right? Which is why, oftentimes, Camus is occasionally read as a kind of as a kind of classical liberal almost, despite the fact that he is explicitly a collectivist, economically speaking, is I think because of this kind of emphasis he places on limits to imposing values on others. Really a lot of his work in The Rebel is an attempt to find a kind of defensive stance for political violence, which is very interesting. It's also probably worth noting here that I think Camus is a little bit unfair to some of the intellectuals around him. For example, he quite often intimates that Sartre was like totally uncritical of the USSR, which I don't think is quite right. I think that, Sartre does still write critical stuff about the USSR, but he does still firmly come down on the support, at least until 1956.
Right, I was going to say it's before the secret speech, right? The Khrushchev speech that sort of revealed everything. Yeah, I think there's a difference in the temperament or how we should think about people who are pro-Soviet Union before and after that moment, and sort of the crushing all of the rebellions in Hungary and I believe in Czech Republic. Yeah, I've been thinking quite a bit recently about sort of like the meta-philosophical question of what are we doing when we're doing philosophy? And I know that this is probably a mistake to try and nail down one thing that it is, because there's obviously a family resemblance, most likely. But it strikes me that it's like a theme that I've definitely discovered through Nietzsche, and now can't unsee it. I see it everywhere, that it seems like the coin of the realm for the philosopher is really to produce a criterion of judgment. It could be a criterion of judgment about any number of things. But, true or false, good or bad, in aesthetics, beauty, ugliness, or the sublime, or any number of other sort of standards that we can come up with. That desire to produce the criterion of judgment. There's that other side that's the skeptical side of philosophy. And, you mentioned Descartes earlier, his influence on Camus. What Descartes is presenting his work as doing is that by subjecting his views to doubt, he can acquire a certainty, that he can have certainty through doubt. But then there are the other types of figures. I've just been talking on my channel about the ancient skeptics, but also Hume, Montaigne, figures who really emphasize the suspension of judgment, the withholding of judgment. Of course, the classical paradox around that is it's a judgment to say you should always withhold your judgments. It's even a judgment to say, well, no, just as a prudential prescription, it'll make you calmer and more tranquil to withhold your judgments. But even that it's like you've come to a definitive claim that you could interpret as against the spirit of skepticism. But it seems to me that what you're getting at with this issue of certainty, something that I take from Wittgenstein when he's sort of talking about how we use concepts, and he's very much in disagreement with Frege of, there's this passage in Philosophical Investigations where he says that Frege says that a blurry boundary is not a boundary at all, or a badly defined region is not really a region. And he says, can't I tell someone, stay roughly here, and just kind of point in a general area? Is that not saying anything at all, or is that actually a meaningful statement? And obviously it is. And in fact, it might actually be a less effective, less meaningful statement if you wanted them to stay exactly there. Don't move at all, stay perfectly still. That's not feasible. It's not practicable. People are going to have to breathe and all of these things. One of the sort of through lines that I've taken from, for example, Philosophical Investigations is that we don't actually need certainty. We don't actually need exactitude in our concepts. Another claim that he makes is that when you step outside of your door, it's possible to doubt that your foot won't hit the pavement. You'll actually step into an abyss. It's not, there are all sorts of possible doubts. Do we actually need to remove those doubts for the sake of action? And so it seems as though maybe one way that Camus can get by with this sort of coming up with a prescription or a judgment is that he doesn't need to say that it's a certain judgment. But then that sort of gets us again into that into that quagmire, right? Because it can always be a vicious circle. Is it a certain judgment that you don't need certain judgments in order to act? All of these things. But it seems as if he's coming to this position, right, that people will revolt against their indignity. They will seek to persist in their existence and their way of life. Do we really need to have an absolute justification? Or is it just simply something that's practicable?
I certainly think that, with my slightly pragmatist leanings, I tend to, that's almost certainly why I've ended up interpreting Camus' I rebel, therefore we exist, as a sort of unavoidable set of actions, because that's kind of the way that I can make it fit in my own meta philosophy. I share the kind of lack of patience, I suppose, with what are sometimes termed paper doubts. Like, are we being deceived by an evil demon? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a sense in which, okay, yeah, but like you've still got to make dinner. What kind of doubt is going on here? Which is one of the reasons why I think that dispositionalism and dispositions are quite a decent way, at the very least, of approaching some of these questions. Yeah, I think that there's an interesting point where Camus seems to draw a distinction. John Folley talks about this in his book, where seems to draw a distinction between kind of infinite hopes, the hopes of a kind of final resolution, and finite hopes, which seem to just sort of be desires, like think, kind of a sense that something might go well in a very kind of grounded, for want of a better term, sort of phenomenal world sense. I suspect that this is maybe where we can place some of his more positive value-expressing ideas, is in this kind of realm of finite hopes, finite desires. He's not saying that this is good for everyone once and for all. He's kind of almost, I think, and I would say inevitably, whenever somebody proposes a set of values, they're doing something like this. It is that he is saying, this is what I value at some level. This is what he finds motivates him due to his particular psychological makeup. And then he is proposing it as, here is what I think will motivate other people as well. It's like at least partly rhetorical, which I think is like, I don't think that's a mark against the argument on the basis that I think that's unavoidable when we're talking about values, is that we're going to end up with some kind of rhetoric, partly because, the example I always use is, imagine if a logician came to you tomorrow and showed through a series of like indubitable proofs that like your entire life's work was now going to be, I don't know, like shredding paper. Like he showed, that was the meaning of life, man. Like it's like, we would understandably turn around and go, I just don't care. Like it doesn't appeal, because like Nietzsche, and I think like Camus, I think that what we value is not consciously chosen, and also not necessarily not a matter of voluntary choice. It's just as much a matter of what you cannot run away from.
Where do you think that leaves the philosopher, is a question I've often pondered. If our philosophies are a confession of impulses, or as Nietzsche says, they think it is a question of the truth, when in fact it is only a question of themselves. The philosopher was simply a vessel through which the impulses were finally able to speak. I tend to agree as well, but does that put us in the position where we're just sort of, philosophy is just this another iteration of a rhetorical game for confessing our own impulses in the most persuasive possible way?
I think that when it comes to value creation, kind of, yeah. Like, as in that's a kind of bullet that I'm quite happy to bite. I think that when it comes to other types of philosophy, I don't think so necessarily. Not necessarily, and by the way, I think you can think that without having to posit some kind of thing in itself noumenal world. I think you can do this just with kind of unforced convergence. So, for example, do I need to posit a kind of thing in itself noumenal world to explain like a simple observational theory or a simple like scientific theory? Well, I don't think so. And I think the kind of mechanism behind that is because, as a matter of fact, we all happen to see the same thing roughly in the same situation, roughly enough such that we can converge on this. Like, I think that convergence, like unforced convergence, is, I think, good enough to do an awful lot of philosophy.
Quickly, some would argue that having a noumenal theory of being might actually be a hindrance to doing that kind of experiment.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a brilliant book by Hasok Chang called Realism for Realistic People, which is a book on the philosophy of science. And he basically kind of takes aim at this idea of like Descartes, like in a kind of quite a Nietzschean way, though I doubt he'd put it that way, takes aim at the kind of coherence of the thing in itself, and of trying to frame the scientific enterprise as trying to get at the external world free from any kind of mental framing. Because he basically says, that seems impossible. And also, like, who cares? Like, if you were to give me a kind of scientific truth about the world that wasn't comprehensible through a human mind, it's just like totally idle. So, and I also just think that generally, it's a deeply non-naturalistic way of conceiving of the human subject, which is fine. If you're like a Thomist, then like knock yourself out. But I'm not, so I can't. I kind of have to start where I am, which is already in the world trying to do things. And that's how I conceive of humanity. And then I have to kind of work from there. I think that a really cool philosopher working on this at the moment is Hugh Price, who coined the term subject naturalism for this, what he saw as a very pragmatist conclusion that fell quite naturally out of naturalism, which I think, if you were to take something like Brian Leiter's interpretation of Nietzsche, I don't think is like that far off what he thinks Nietzsche's doing with naturalism. And I certainly don't think it's that far off some of Hume's ideas, talking about, although Hume hangs on to the external world in some sense. I think that Hume is, in many ways, as much as he's a kind of proto-logical empiricist, I think he's also a proto-pragmatist, in that, he's trying to figure out what the world looks like, from human minds, not like from, he's not trying to work out, the world in itself. It's human nature, not and human inquiry.
Yeah.
Or
Well, it's interesting because in the Vienna Circles manifesto, who are very influenced by Wittgenstein, and and very much by Hume as well. I mean, they practically take Hume's fork as dogma. That you should, put to the flame any book that's not experimental matters of fact or demonstrative logical reasoning. But in their manifesto or their treatise, they say man is the measure of all things. They quote from Protagoras. Nothing is inaccessible to man. And it's interesting because there's this through line, right? So the sophists, they believed in sort of counterposing two equally persuasive points of view and showing how they could both be argued. They're very influential on sort of the skeptics. It just struck me that yeah, the Vienna Circle is actually way closer to the sophists than they would be to like Socrates. Socrates is going on and on about justice and the good life. Those are all sort of, as we were speaking of earlier, those are subjective judgments that people then try to just rhetorically persuade other people about, but they're not clear, meaningful concepts that this morality is based on. It's funny because I always sort of, when I was first getting into philosophy, I instinctively like disdained the Vienna Circle and that entire like vibe and just the whole idea of like, okay, philosophy is here to just sort of clarify concepts for science, and all of ethics and like the most important stuff of life is sort of chucked away because we can't meaningfully really talk about it. I've come to realize that I actually agree with him more than I would like to, because it's out of my sort of love for the sophists and their approach of doing things, that it's not necessarily that we should never talk about these issues or that they have no place in sort of the intellectual discourse. That's maybe where the Vienna Circle went a bit too far. But that, again, you can always present a narrative and a counter-narrative. You can present a proposition and a counter-proposition. And, as Hume argues as well, when it comes to vice and virtue, it's really just a reflection of our sentiments, of our preferences for things. And so these debates can sort of just go on forever. And that seems to be why philosophy, as long as it's concerned with these things, can never really be solved. Because how do you solve morality? You're really saying, like, how do we come to the end of all human problems or challenges? As long as people are alive and continuing to engage with those problems and challenges, you're going to have people who are going to try and tackle them through philosophy. But it does. I always have a sort of a nagging doubt then about like what we're doing as philosophers, because it definitely seems as though the sophist approach of just making our rhetoric as powerful as we possibly can seems like, well, then what could be more worthwhile? Isn't Socrates then doesn't he deserve to be upbraided by Thrasymachus and Gorgias and all of these figures for misleading people with these unclear, ultimately rather vague ideas? And then, of course, Plato leads us into the otherworldism, the idealism that Nietzsche criticized. And so in a very strange way, there is something about the very like empirical, pragmatic approach to life that ends up being both modern and very, very ancient, and appealing to the deep roots of these conversations that have gone back for millennia now.
There's a really interesting philosopher and historian of philosophy called Cheryl Mizak, who draws these connections between logical empiricism and pragmatism. And it really is, once you go looking for it, you'll definitely find it. In Language, Truth and Logic, and also in almost all of the introduction to loads of Carnap's logical empiricist work, they will often frame their version of Hume's fork as a pragmatic constraint. They'll just say, it's not that this is really interesting, when Ayer proposes his definition of meaningfulness, the classic response to it is that it's self-refuting, right? Because, you're proposing this definition of meaningfulness, but is that an analytic truth or is it an empirical truth? And Ayer can kind of reply, no, it's an analytic truth. It's how I'm defining meaningfulness. And then he supports that, not with a philosophical argument, but with a pragmatic one. He says, I predict that debates that don't fall into either of these camps will run on forever without making progress. You can dispute that. That's ultimately an empirical claim. But he's not contradicting himself there. He's just saying, he's just giving a pragmatic argument for what he thinks the most fruitful way to do philosophy is. And, in this, it's interesting you bring the connection with the sophists, because I really think that a lot of the logical empiricist stuff, even though I think at a first order level, I think they, as you say, I think they often go too far. I think that a lot of what they end up trying to do is working out the consequences to philosophy of abandoning noumena and just like trying to make do with man as the measure of all things. And you can think that that's a foolish quest, or you can think that they failed in the way that they tried to undertake it. But in a lot of ways, that seems to be the animating spirit behind much of the Vienna Circle's work. It's kind of like, I don't know, it's if you want like a really controversial thing to say at a dinner party, you can say that the Vienna Circle's working in the tradition of Nietzsche, which is like not true, but it's a fun thing to say. But in terms of merely, the incomprehensibility of the thing in itself, man is the measure of all things. That vein of thought, they're very much working in that spirit of inquiry.
To sort of pivot from that, there was recently, I guess, probably around a month ago, a sort of new spat of analytic philosophers and continental philosophers going at each other on Twitter or X. I don't know if you follow any of that.
It got over to Substack eventually, so yeah.
What do you think about that? Because I mean, what we're sort of articulating here is that in many ways, the new chapter in philosophy that they're turning over with analytical philosophy, if people buy the argument we're making, it's not that it's not really new. It's just that it's not such a radical departure from continental philosophy as perhaps it was experienced as. And perhaps a lot of that had to do with the Vienna Circle probably rebelling against Hegel and Kant and Fichte and this German idealist tradition that use these concepts like will and Geist that are kind of hard to exactly define and say exactly what you're talking about when you're saying that absolute mind is revealing itself through the mutual recognition of man. But I don't, so I can understand the context of trying to sort of like clear away. I mean, Hume makes a very similar point where he's talking about the abstruse philosophy as being like the forest where robbers can hide and despoil you. And therefore we have to become good navigators of the forest ourselves, and so we have to understand metaphysics effectively so we can destroy it and not be misled by it. But again, Hume, in many ways, you could consider him much closer in writing style to the continental tradition. You have other examples like Spinoza, where he reads more like an analytical philosopher. And so I've always just wondered why the animosity, why the Twitter beef? Is the Twitter beef real? How do you see the state of analytic and continental philosophy right now and the relation between them?
I think, first of all, I used to, again, this is a joke that's not true, but I used to joke that every great work of philosophy begins by saying there's loads of rubbish philosophy. Because, at the beginning of the phenomenology of spirit, Hegel also takes like just pot shots at people who's like, oh, these kind of sentimentalists kind of just BSing us. But,
Nietzsche too. Nietzsche says every philosopher hitherto has denied life. I am the only one who's realized it. Yeah.
And I love it. And I think it's great to begin your great work of philosophy by just kind of pissing on a bunch of other philosophers. Because partly because I think that's oftentimes that's actually quite a fruitful way to develop your own philosophical thinking.
Another one really quick is so many philosophers will criticize past philosophers for thinking that some version of the claim, like reason can get us all the way to the truth, but we actually need something else, and it might be faith, it might be values, and then I read most philosophers, and that almost none of them make that claim that reason can get you all the way to the truth, right?
It's funny you said that, because I think that a fair amount of the analytic-continental dispute is sort of talking past one another. I mean, I think that part of the issue is that nobody can be like incredibly familiar with analytic philosophy and continental philosophy, because basically nobody can be really familiar with either of those fields, because they're both massive and they both have, I would argue, far more variation within them than they do across one another. And you also, you get philosophers that straddle the divide quite comfortably. I'm thinking about people like Richard Rorty, right? This is a thinker who grew up in the analytic tradition, writes in a very analytic style, and yet is also both draws inspiration from continental philosophy and is kind of making splashes in that area too. So I think that it's definitely more a matter of degree than of kind. I think that a lot of the time what happens is that somebody will take like a passage from Judith Butler, say. Like, I've tried to read Gender Trouble and I don't understand it. I don't think that's because she's talking nonsense. I just don't think I have the kind of requisite knowledge and kind of background to understand it. But, somebody will post a kind of out of context passage from Judith Butler and say, doesn't this look like nonsense? And then people will go, yeah, And then, a continental philosopher will say, they'll post a passage from like Formal Ethics or something where analytic philosophy immediately looks insane, and will say, this is analytic philosophy. And a bunch of people who are kind of quite hostile towards analytic philosophy will say, yeah, that looks awful. And I think a lot of the time what's happening is that, yeah, they're just kind of talking past one another. I think that there could be much more room for straightforward dialogue, partly because I think that, think of a thinker like Rorty, right? Made real waves often by connecting bits of continental and analytic philosophy together. Or John Dewey's another example. There are loads of them in the American pragmatist tradition. They just kind of crop up. John Dewey began his work trying to naturalize Hegel and eventually gave up on it. But it really is apparent in a lot of his later pragmatist writing that he's still drawing on his kind of Hegelian background. He's talking about how the correct conception of the organism and environment isn't as two separate things; it's as one interconnected thing, which is clearly from his earlier Hegelian background, and he's bringing it forward into what we'd now say is a more American pragmatism is seen as a strain of analytic philosophy, but ultimately that's something that he has been inspired by continental philosophy. And you can see these tracks all over the place. As we just pointed out, logical empiricism and logical positivism, the Vienna Circle, are not saying things too dissimilar from some interpretations of aspects of what Nietzsche's saying, even if obviously they disagree on a lot as well. I just think that there's a lot less. Obviously, there are differences in style and things like that. But I don't know. I think a lot of the beef is sort of just mutual misunderstanding, and partly that's because it takes a lot of patience to like sit down and listen to a new field. If I was going to become really familiar with Judith Butler, that would take me so long.
Yeah, I think, well, so to go with what the meme arguments are, I mean, I remember one of the sort of analytic philosophers saying, have continental philosophers ever thought about just stating their points in clear, meaningful sentences? I mean, that could be really helpful for them if they try to figure out what they're going to say and say it clearly without, And so that's like sort of the perception of, like I'll give you an example. Somebody whose work I really enjoy, Paul Katsafanis. He's a Nietzschean constitutivist, sort of following off of, I guess it was Christine Korsgaard and a few others who view Kant as a constitutivist. It's like a certain framework for viewing morality where you're looking at the constitutive parts, so whereas Kant would say that freedom or something like that, that's the constitutive part of human action. For Nietzsche, it's power. And so that's how his way of explaining what will to power is treating power as something which is constitutive of action. And therefore, as when you're seeking power, you're looking for new ways to expand your possibilities and potential for acting. In a lot of ways, that does take, like if you read Nietzsche, you're never going to get as clear and straightforward an explanation of what will to power is. Even in the book called Will to Power, you're not going to find that. Instead, you're going to find comments, remarks laced throughout these books with 300 aphorisms in them on all sorts of different topics. And oftentimes phrased in a way that, is more attentive to the prose than it is towards logical clarity. Now, obviously, you and I both enjoy like clarity and a good read, and the prose poetry. But what do you think of that claim that, because it could be problematic for the continental philosopher in some sense if he admits like, yeah, okay, what you analytics do when you engage with our philosophy is you do make it clearer. In a way, you kind of like find the actual nutrients out of this. I'm not exactly sure what I think of it, because on the one hand, I have experienced examples of analytic philosophers who do seem to do this. And yet something within me rebels against that, where I'm like, but no, you have to sit down and read the gay science. You have to experience it.
There's not nothing in it, right? I think that even for thinkers that I really admire, like Nietzsche, there is, I found real benefit reading. For example, I just realized I pronounced Paul Katsafanis' name wrong in the video that I made on his work like 20 times. But Paul Katsafanis' writings on like Nietzsche's like theories about psychology and stuff, I find that very edifying. I find it very edifying to read that and then go back and to read the aphorisms he's citing and think, okay, let's. Another one is Maud Marie Clark. Like I would not have been able to make heads or tails of Nietzsche's ideas on truth without the work of Maud Marie Clark. It's just like you could have sat me down for 100 years and I would never have made all of the necessary linkages. It's just so incredibly clever. At the same time, if you were to sit down and read, say Brian Leiter, right? Brian Leiter's very, very cool naturalist reading of Nietzsche. I don't think that he'd mind me saying that it certainly leaves something out of Nietzsche. Partly because I think just the act of sitting there and trying to wrestle with an aphorism is in and of itself very, very valuable. Not least of which because I think that's kind of the starting point for secondary Nietzsche scholarship. A lot of these are people thinking very hard about Nietzsche's primary text. If you like Nietzsche's secondary scholarship, you don't get there without the primary sources. At the same time, I also think that, it's almost impossible to capture the same richness of Nietzsche's original text in a commentary, partly because you, in your attempt to make it neat and coherent in a kind of an amenable to the analytic eye, you have to cut things out because Nietzsche, taken in and of himself, is not amenable to the analytic eye. You can see that as a weakness. That's perfectly fine. Well, I think that Nietzsche is also almost a special case here, partly because the emotive and rhetorically laden way of writing makes so much more sense in the context of his philosophy. He can't write, given his overall, or what I take his overall project to be, he can't write without appealing to the instincts and the affects, because then he just wouldn't be achieving the thing that he wants to achieve. So that there's that element to it. I think that Nietzsche certainly has an incredibly good internal reason to write the way he does. I think that it's difficult, right? Because while I think all of that is true, I couldn't in good conscience be like, everyone go away and write philosophy in that style. Because the reason that Nietzsche can get away with this is because he's like a genius, right? Like I can get away with writing like that because I'm not. I think about, people like Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein's very revered in the analytic tradition. And Wittgenstein is interpretations of Wittgenstein are lobbed back and forth constantly. You've got Paul Horwich's interpretation where he's effectively dissolving philosophy to core. That's kind of his view on things, which is very different from the kind of Saul Kripke's reading of Wittgenstein. So you have this battle. And I don't think anyone in the analytic tradition would say, oh, Wittgenstein's pointless because he doesn't write clearly. At the same time, the reason why he can do that is because he's a genius. So I don't know. I suppose that there's a disconnect there between the fact that actually, reading a lot of these thinkers who write emotively and unclearly, but also richly and contentfully. It's when I'm reading Nietzsche, it's not that the aphorism is unhelpfully vague. It's almost that it is so rich in content that it can be taken in so many different directions. It's not vague from a paucity of insight. It's vague from a richness of insight. And if you were to ask me, like, oh, Joe, come up with an algorithmic procedure for how to separate philosophy that's like that from philosophy that's unhelpfully vague, like I would just have to shrug my shoulders and say I can't. It may be a kind of, what's that, pornography ruling in the US? You know it when you see it. I think sometimes, rich but a little bit unclear writing is like that. And I think that's why some people come away from reading Nietzsche thinking like, oh, this is vague and it's not pinned down. What I would say is that whenever I encounter a text that I really struggle with, so Lacan's a really good example for me. Like I'm slowly trying to understand Lacan and I find it so difficult. Yeah, and anyone who views my channel will know that like it's a running joke that whenever I get a comment being like, oh, you should look at some post-war French philosophy, I reply saying, no, I don't understand it at all. Like I've tried, I'm not like, but it would just take, it takes so much familiarity. And I was told to start with Lacan. So that's where I'm starting. And that is very difficult to understand. In fact, Todd McGowan's introduction to Lacan begins, I think it's actually the first line, or it's on the first page with Lacan is one of the most misinterpreted thinkers of the 20th century. And I remember reading that and thinking, great, this is going to be a walk in the park. But Lacan's a very good example, right? If I hadn't approached Lacan and didn't continue to approach Lacan in a kind of spirit of charity, thinking, okay, loads of really, really clever people have got an awful lot from this. At the very least, I don't want to dismiss it without giving it a really, really good go. Then, yeah, I would have read like 2 pages and gone, I don't know, this seems like incomprehensible nonsense and thrown it away. And that would have been a mistake. And it also would have deprived me of the stuff that I've learnt very, very slowly as I kind of try and slog my way through the seminars. That's very, very insightful, right? The kind of the early attempts to sort of naturalize some Kantian insight. If I hadn't have gone in with a principle of charity, I would just be depriving myself. I suppose maybe that's my whole point, is like, you're only cheating yourself by dismissing these philosophers. And, if you give it a good go and you think, oh, I disagree with them, or I still think they're nonsense, then fine. But just try it out and see. Of course, I'm mainly talking to my kind of fellow people with an analytic background there.
Right. To play as their analytical advocate or analytics advocate. I mean, I guess, or indeed Hume, right? Maybe the concern is that precisely the thing we were talking about before, that a lot of this imprecise but perhaps rich and very seductive and poetic writing is going to contain rhetorical flourishes that are really just sort of persuading someone over to another person's way of thinking. And maybe that's like a kind of pollution of philosophy or something like that.
I think it depends what you're trying to do. I think that if you're trying to propose a value system, I think that rhetoric is just unavoidable, if nothing else. If you're trying to propose a radical change in what someone values, you're going to have to use some kind of emotive techniques, right? I think that obviously, you couldn't construct a logical proof out of emotion. I think it depends on the job you're trying to do. The other
everyone in the comments, give us your logical proof constructed out of emotion.
But the other thing I think about when it comes to some of the continental philosophy that I've read, and I should say, I've been reading, I first started reading continental philosophy about 4 years ago, so I'm still really quite new to it. A lot of the time I see continental and especially like existential thinkers, they're trying to describe something that is fuzzy at the boundaries, right? Reading a thinker who's talking about what it means for someone to have a sense of felt meaning, it's like, well, is it entirely fair to expect them to be as precise as when, say, Gödel is trying to prove something within the mathematical system of Principia Mathematica? It's like, well, no, it's not fair, really. It's like if you approach matters that are inherently a little bit fuzzy around the edges with too much precision, I think you just end up kind of overfitting, right? You end up cutting off the hard bits in order to make it as precise as possible. And think about all of the human emotions of deep existential import, like love, that are explored through poetry and song and plays and novels. If you were to burn every bit of fiction that was ever written about love, I think you would lose a fair amount of our philosophy of love. Even though, you open The Red and the Black by Stendhal, it doesn't have proposition one, love is X, Y, and Z, But nonetheless, you get to the end with a sort of a greater insight into a certain idea of love. And I think it's very important for us to make room for that. Sometimes a demand for absolute specification can then encourage us to take something that is inherently a bit fuzzy and chop it into simpler pieces to the detriment of what we cared about in the first place. I think that a fair amount of content philosophy falls into that camp because it's evaluating difficult stuff.
Yeah, one of the most maligned philosophy books that many people would say is not even philosophy, but I will always defend is Pirsig's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. But he has this split between classical and romantic, and he describes logic as like a knife. I was thinking about that when you were talking about like chopping up these things that are really important to us. But it's interesting because he has a very analytical mind. He is literally quite apt and capable of doing his own motorcycle maintenance on his trip. He knows every little aspect of its engineering and all of these things. And he recognizes that about himself, that he tends to have this sort of like incisive rationality that sort of wants to come in and make these distinctions and make them very clear and well delineated. And it's a lot of the book is sort of a struggle with self-integration. Also literally a struggle with self-integration because he has sort of two personalities. And I don't know to what extent that's actually true with Pirsig or to what extent it's a literary flourish, but he's sort of trying to become one person again after a psychotic break that in the book is dramatized as a psychotic break basically created by philosophy, basically created by trying to wrangle with these impossible questions that you can never get exactness with, and pursuing that so long and so hard that it breaks his mind essentially. So I think about that quite often. It's perhaps perhaps it's an overly simplistic way of looking at things, of simply classical versus romantic, sort of Aristotle versus sort of, Goethe and the German romantics and all of this. But it gets at, when you were bringing up Stendhal, and that there's truth there about love. That was something that Jordan Peterson always used to talk about, right back in the old days. The fact that there's philosophy in all the great works of literature, there's psychology in them. They're not just delightful romps for your distraction or your mere entertainment. They're actually conveying something to you. That would be maybe the eternal tension that's going to be there between the more classically minded analytic people and the more romantically minded continental people. Is really what they're getting at, is that the way they were writing philosophy was really more conveying truth sort of in that same manner that a novel would do so. The kind of truth you would get from Nietzsche might be more similar to the truth you get from reading Moby Dick or the Iliad than it would be from reading Russell's, Principles of Mathematics or something like that.
The other thing that I think that continental philosophy does far better than analytic philosophy is the history of philosophy, right? So it is possible to go through an analytic philosophy degree and not learn very much history of philosophy. I think that's also a mistake. I think history of philosophy is really important. And I think that's something that, if you were to identify a very positive thing about the continental style of writing, is that they'll often be openly acknowledging kind of the genealogy of their thoughts as they go along. That's very, very helpful. That's something that I'd like to do more of, almost. It's kind of it's I think it's incredibly useful thing to do, because you can see where ideas emerged from.
Yeah, one of my favorite books of all time is Diogenes Laertius, The Lives of Eminent Philosophers. You could say, well, so many of their ideas are irrelevant now, or they've been sort of outmoded, or there's somebody else came along who said it better, but it's their lives that are really interesting. And the fact that they always sort of embody these different perspectives. That's one of the things I like about Nietzsche. His lectures on the pre-Platonic philosophers is sort of this fascinating series of lives that he presents. And indeed, it's something I try to do with my own channel. Well, Joe, it's been a great, fascinating conversation. I've learned quite a lot, or I've been pointed in many interesting directions as we were talking about. That's sort of what we try to do, is point people in the direction of further knowledge, further enrichment, things, discovering the treasures of literature and philosophy from the past. Did you want to shout out anything at the end of what you're working on, or anything you want people to know about?
One thing is that I have two ongoing projects that will take, just personal projects, isn't necessarily anything to the channel. One is to crack post-war French philosophy, because it's like my white whale. I struggle with it so much. So I'm never going to end up making a video on it, because even when I do crack it, it'll just be a kind of personal victory. But that's something that I'm trying to work on, sort of increasingly, as I say, starting with Akin and moving forwards. I'm working on a video on Dostoevsky's Demons at the moment, which I think would be really good fun. That I think is I think it's the hardest Dostoevsky novel to talk about. So I'm very excited to talk about it, because it's in my view much more complex than something like Crime and Punishment. I love Crime and Punishment. In fact, I prefer reading Crime and Punishment to Demons. But I think that Demons is such an incredibly rich text. And similar to what we were talking about with Camus earlier, it's so rich in internal tensions that it's so hard to write about. So I'm really looking forward to writing about that. Kind of been planning it. I've been reading a lot of Simone Weil. I kind of who I am really enjoying. I've got a real fondness for kind of Christian mysticism. That's kind of recently developed. I read Revelations of Divine Love a couple of years ago, and that got me onto Eckhart, and now I'm on Vey. So that's been really interesting. Anyone who's really unconvinced, just give them a go. I promise you'll get something from them, even if you can't quite put your finger on it. Yeah, I suppose that's kind of mainly what I'm working on at the moment. It's really it's really good fun.
Awesome. Joe, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, thank you for having me on.
Signing off.
If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it, or on social media. Thank you for your support.